And this is one of the last Psalms that David ever wrote. And as he wrote it, he was looking back throughout his lifetime, and he was remembering the battles and the victories and the help that God had given him throughout his lifetime. Now, Psalm 18 begins with a title: To the chief musician, a psalm of David, the servant of the Lord, who spoke to the Lord the words of this song on the day that the Lord delivered him from the hand of all his enemies and from the hand of Saul. Now, of the 150 psalms, 116 of them have titles. In some English translations of the Bible, the titles are left out. You can't even find them. Or sometimes the titles are written in very, very, very tiny small print, as if though they were not important. But in the Hebrew scriptures, these titles are incorporated into the Psalms. They are either the first verse of the Psalm, or they are part of the first verse of the Psalm. They are an important part of each Psalm. These titles are not modern-day add-ons. They go all the way back to the pre-exilic period, the time before Ezra and Nehemiah. So we're going to look at the Psalm 18 in 3 sections. Number 1, Saul. Number 2, David's enemies. And number 3, David's worst enemy. Now in Psalm 18, David was mainly writing about the victory God gave him over 2 distinct categories of people. All his enemies in one category, and Saul in the other category. And I want you to notice that Saul is not included in the enemy category. It doesn't say God delivered David from all of his enemies, Saul being the worst of all of them. It doesn't say God delivered David from all of his enemies, and Saul was the most tremendous, horrible enemy of them all. It doesn't say that. It says God delivered David from all of his enemies, and also God delivered David from Saul. He is not in the enemy category because David did not consider Saul to be an enemy. Now, if you had someone in your life like Saul who wanted to use your body as the bullseye for his javelin practice, and who gathered thousands of soldiers together for about 6 years to destroy you and hunt you down and remove you from the face of the earth, you might say that's an enemy. But David didn't. Now, all of David's enemies would include the Philistines, the Moabites, the Ammonites, the Arameans, the Edomites, Hadad-ezer, king of Zobah, Hamath, and the inhabitants of Tibhath and Kun, etc., etc., etc. He had a lot of enemies, all right? The list goes on and on. They were all in David's enemy category. And the other category had in it Saul. Just Saul. He was special. He had his own category. And we see these 2 categories throughout this psalm. In verse 17, David wrote this: God delivered me from my strong enemy, and he delivered me from them which hated me. 2 categories: the strong enemies and Saul, the one who hated him. In verse 47 and 48, David wrote this: God delivers me from my enemies. He also lifts me up above those who rise against me. You delivered me from the violent man. 2 categories: strong enemies and Saul. In verse 37 and 38, David wrote this: I have pursued my enemies. I have overtaken them. I didn't turn back until they were destroyed. I wounded them so that they couldn't arise. They have fallen under my feet. Verse 42. I beat them up. They were like dust before the wind. I cast them out like dirt in the streets. Verse 35. And your gentleness has made me great. Well, it doesn't sound very gentle to me. Beating people up, casting them out like dirt on the street, driving them away so that they can't get up. But in verse 35, David was talking about his reaction to Saul. Your gentleness has made me great. God's gentleness, God's meekness, God's humility and condescension had been worked into David's life. And David said, that is what has made me great. You know, we think of David as a man after God's own heart because the Bible tells us that. But we don't look at all the people he killed and say, wow, a man after God's own heart. Right? No. We look at his love for the Lord and we look at his love for his enemies. And that's when we say he was a man after God's own heart. God's gentleness is what made him great. Now, David was brutal to his enemies, but towards Saul, David was gentle. And in the book of Judges, there's a story about Samson. One day, Samson killed a lion. And then later, he went back and he saw in the carcass of the lion that bees had made a hive with honey in it. And Samson said this: out of that which was strong came forth that which is sweet. David was like that. He was strong, but he was sweet. So let's start in category 1. Saul. So what was he? What was Saul? He wasn't an enemy. David didn't consider him to be an enemy. If he's not an enemy, what was he? Well, he was the vehicle by which David was brought to the throne. Saul was a trial. He was a thorn in the flesh. He was a man with many faults, but he was not an enemy. And we know that David was a fighter. David was a mighty warrior. David was the man who marched with his band of 600 men. He was marching to Nabal's house to kill Nabal, wipe him off the face of the earth with every male, young or old, or even little tiny babies in Nabal's household because Nabal insulted him. David was a warrior. David was a fighter. He was a man of war, a man of bloodshed. That's actually the reason why God did not allow David to build the temple in 1 Chronicles 22:8. God said, look, David, you've killed a lot of people, and killing people and building a temple are not compatible with each other. All right? You can't build my temple. And yet that same warrior, David, never rose up against Saul because he did not consider Saul to be his enemy. And when Saul finally died, David wept. I would have wept too, tears of joy. Oh, thank you, Lord. He's God. But David didn't weep tears of joy. He just wept tears. He cried. There's a half of a chapter about it in 2 Samuel chapter 1, verses 17 through 27. And David said things like this about Saul. He said, the beauty of Israel is slain on its high places. He said, the mighty are fallen. He said that about Saul. He said Saul and his son Jonathan were beloved. They were pleasant in their lives. He said, you women of Israel, weep for Saul. I mean, you read it, it's beautiful. It's a beautiful eulogy. But really, pleasant? Saul was pleasant in his lifetime? Really? He was the beauty of Israel? Was he really? I read that, I'm like, how could that be? And it's difficult to reconcile David's beautiful eulogy of Saul with Saul's horrible actions unless you realize that David did not consider Saul to be his enemy. David's army commander, named Joab, was completely disgusted with David's love for those who were against him. First it was Saul, then it was Abner, then Ishbosheth, then later it was Absalom. And David's biggest fault, according to Joab, was David's love for those who hated him. Joab complained about it in 2 Samuel 19, verse 6. He said, "You love those who hate you." Joab considered it to be a fault. The Lord considered it to be a virtue. And I think one of the greatest challenges in David's life was Saul. It's easier to have victory over enemies than to have victory over Saul. Basically, David's enemies were not really going to be a big problem. God took care of them. God handled them. When David faced the giant Goliath was not really a problem. Goliath fell with the first stone that David threw at him. And if something falls and dies the first time you throw a stone at it, it's going to be easy to live with. All right? Enemies were not a big problem. If it dies really easily, it's not going to be a real big problem to you. God takes the enemies down. But dealing with Saul year after year after year, oh my. It's more difficult and it's more complicated because it's something that involves character on a daily basis. That's more difficult. And sometimes I think the real giant of a problem was Saul and not the enemies. See, it doesn't take character to defeat enemies. You look at the kings in the Old Testament. Some of them were corrupt, they were idolaters, they compromised, and they won battle after battle after battle after battle. It does not necessarily take character to win a battle. But I'll tell you what, it does take character to live with Saul day after day after day. And so that is the bigger problem. And I want us for a minute to just look at Joshua chapter 1, verse 6. I can't believe it, I'm cold. It's cold in here. Joshua 1:6. Now at this time there was a change of leadership in Israel. Joshua was taking over from Moses. And it's interesting to see how God speaks to Joshua again and again and again. God repeats this many times. In Joshua 1:6, God said to Joshua, "Joshua, be strong and of good courage." Verse 7, "Only be strong and be very courageous." And sometimes we think that God is encouraging Joshua about being strong because of the enemies. But actually, Joshua had 40 years of experience with Moses fighting against the enemies. God is not referring to the enemies when he tells Joshua to be strong and of good courage. In verse 7, the Lord said, "Joshua, be strong and very courageous to do according to all the law." And it's an exhortation, not to fight enemies, but to do according to the law. And it takes greater strength of character to fully obey God's law than it does to win military battles. God was telling Joshua, be strong, be courageous, do according to my law. And that's where we need courage. God takes care of the enemies. He brings them down. But we need character We need character to do according to his law. And what is the law? What is it? Well, two things. One, love God. Two, love people. And that takes courage and faith, especially if one of the people you are called to love is Saul. The problem that God was looking at with Joshua was not the problem of Jericho or the enemies in the land of Canaan. God was going to have Joshua march 7 times around Jericho, yell, ah! Boom, down comes the wall. That was not going to be a problem. God's concern was, would Joshua be the kind of person who would have the courage to be a living example of someone who will follow the law? Would Joshua have the courage to love God and love people in the midst of very difficult and conflicting circumstances? That is what God's concern was. And Joshua said to the people, you choose this day who you will serve, but as for me and my house, we're going to serve the Lord. And Joshua made the stand that he was going to do right. He would have the courage to live in the midst of all the people with all of their quirks, with all of their faults, with all of their challenges, with all of their complaints, and with all of their opposing opinions, and he would do what was right. He would love God, and he would love the people. That took courage, and that took strength. He would follow the law, and so would David. Love God and love the people. But David loved Saul at a great cost to himself. David was misused, abused, confused, accused, slandered, maligned, and he had his reputation ruined by King Saul. And yet David was not offended by Saul. He didn't take up a reproach against King Saul. In Psalm 15, David wrote the qualifications of those who will abide in God's tabernacle. And one of those qualifications is found in verse 3. And there it says, Psalm 15, verse 3, those who do no wrong to their neighbor, nor take up a reproach against a friend. They will be able to abide in God's tabernacle. Leviticus 19:18 says, do not take up an offense or have something against your neighbor, but love your neighbor as you love yourself. That's the Old Testament. That's not the New Testament. Love your neighbor as you love yourself. And our reaction to difficult people is a barometer of our character. It's a measurement of our meekness or lack of meekness, of our humility or our pride. Our reaction to difficult people shows us who we really are. It exposes our character. It shows us what's inside of us. And David was like a lamb who was sheared of its wool. You know, a lamb has wool. It belongs to the lamb. It's the lamb's. He grew it. It's his. A lamb has wool. And then a shearer comes along and he takes the wool off of that lamb. He doesn't recompense the lamb. He doesn't pay the lamb for it. He doesn't ask the lamb, may I take your wool? He just takes it and he doesn't say please. And when he's finished, he doesn't say thank you. And he leaves, he doesn't even say sorry. He just takes it, and that little lamb is stripped of its warmth, of its covering, and of its identity. And I wonder if we could just see a little lamb. Can we see that? They're supposed to be words. He says, that's okay, little lamb. Things will get better. You look pink now, and everybody's laughing at you. But you know, sometimes you're up and sometimes you're down. See, I've watched this a lot. I've got grandkids. I'm a grandmother. But you need to rebound. Things will get better. He says, you know, I used to be something. I used to be covered with fluff. And now my friends laugh at me. He's going to get better. Don't worry. It ends happy. Okay, you get the idea. That's like David. When Saul came and took all of his fluff and didn't say please and didn't say thank you. But you know, a lamb doesn't complain. It doesn't become bitter at the shearer. It doesn't hate the shearer. And David was not bitter at Saul. A lamb isn't offended by losing its wool. And David was not offended by Saul. Some keep an accounting of offenses every time someone takes some of their wool. And by taking up a reproach against their neighbor, they disqualify themselves for a higher place in God. You know, many years ago, back in the 80s, when my family first came to Palawan, we lived in a house. We were in the jungle at a place called Ilog, and we lived in a house that had so many termites in it that so many termites in the wood, you could hear the termites eating the house at night. We would put our ears to the walls, any wall, and you could hear the termites eating the wood. It was very creepy. We pulled down 7-meter-long wooden beams to replace them, 7 meters long, and we carried them with 3 fingers because they were hollow inside. They had been completely eaten up by termites. They were very, very light. And those termites undermined the strength of the house. But I discovered that they were not the only termites living in that house. There were others, and every day I could hear them chewing and chewing and chewing. They were inside of me. See, we had come from a church whose leader was very, very difficult. He was a shearer. He had good areas of his life, the main pastor, but he also had some areas of corruption. And you know, if you've lived or served under someone who is corrupt, it's very difficult. And for 3.5 years, he removed the wool from us. He shared us. He didn't say please. He didn't say thank you. He didn't say sorry. And from there, we moved to Palawan. And we were more than 13,000 kilometers away. And still my thoughts were like termites, eating inside of me, weakening me, just as those termites were weakening the strength of our house. I had taken up a reproach against that man. I was like Jeremiah, remembering the wormwood and the gall. I was like Chief Never Forget, the Indian chief. There's an Indian chief called Chief Never Forget. He remembered everything. One day a tourist went to a city and he saw an Indian chief sitting in front of a building. And he asked someone, who's that? You know, an Indian chief with his feathers and everything. They said, that's Chief Never Forget. He never forgets anything. The tourist thought, I don't believe it. I'm going to go ask him. And he went to Chief Never Forget, and he said, hey, Chief, 15 years ago, exactly to today, 15 years ago exactly from today, what did you eat for breakfast? Chief Never Forget said, eggs. I ate eggs. Ooh, the man was impressed. He remembers 15 years ago. He remembers exactly what he ate for breakfast. How about that? Wow. That tourist went back home and told his friends about Chief Never Forget. And one of his friends said, wow, a real Indian chief. What did you say to him? The tourist said, well, I went up to him. I said, hey, Chief, you know what? They said, you can't do that to an Indian chief. He's like an official person. He's like a king, or he's the head of his whole tribe. You can't just go up to him and say, hey, Chief. The proper way is you lift your hand and you give a proper Indian chief greeting. You lift your hand and you say, how? That's the proper greeting. Well, the man said, oh, I didn't know. 6 years later, he was on a trip again, and he was being a tourist. He went back to the same city, and there was Chief Never Forget, still sitting in front of that same building. And that man thought, I'll go over and I'll say hi. And he walked over to Chief Never Forget, lifted his hand, and said, how? And Chief Never Forget said, scrambled. They were scrambled. Scrambled eggs. I'm sorry. I was like that. Remembering everything, not forgetting anything. And I prayed, and I prayed, and I prayed for a year. And I still remember the day when I didn't think about the shearer. I remember the day when it was evening time, and I thought, oh, I didn't think about that. I didn't think about that at all. And I said, God delivered me from the hand of Saul. And if there is a Saul in your life, I want to tell you to let go of the bad feelings you have towards that person, no matter what he or she has done to you. Ask God for his love to flow through you. Have pity on that person. Have compassion. That person, that Saul is troubled. That Saul is wrong. But that Saul is there to help move you into the place that you're supposed to be. That Saul will help propel you into your inheritance. Thank God for that Saul. And you know, I was thinking, how did Saul become Saul? How did he become Saul? Saul started out very, very good. He started out really good. How did he get those Saul-esque characteristics that he's so famous for? Those horrible characteristics. Well, very simple. Somebody sang a song. The women sang a song. After David slew Goliath, they sang a song. Saul has slain his thousands. David his 10,000s. And Saul became jealous. Saul took up a reproach against David. Saul became offended over David, saying, what, they attribute 1,000 to me and 10,000 to him? And Saul became Saul because he became offended at David. That was the beginning of his downfall. You know, he should have been happy to have David as one of his people in the army. I would love to have David protecting me. Wouldn't you? If you need people to protect you, who do you want? Some guy you never heard of, Harry, Larry, Joe? No, you want David. You want David to protect you. David was an honor in Saul's kingdom. Saul should have been thankful. He should have been happy, but he didn't. He wanted to be on top. He wanted to be the strongest, the bravest, the mightiest, being the most renowned for killing the most people, the most heroic. And he could not let somebody be better than him, and he became Saul. Now, we should be happy when people become better than us. We should want that. We want our children to be better than us. We want our coworkers to be better than us. I love our staff. They are teachers. They are all teachers, and they're better teachers than me. And I love it. I love it. Work me out of a job. I'm tired. I've never been to Boracay. Maybe I could go to Boracay. I don't know. I love it. Saul should have been happy. And for people who want to be on top, and they cannot let anyone get ahead of them, it's on the pathway of Saul. And we should want people to go farther than us. We're in a relay race. We go so far, we hand it, and other people run. And you know, I have my daughters. I have one daughter. She wants to be always the best, and that's a good thing. But she wants to be the best. And if she's not the best, it would be so hard for her, especially when she was in college. She called me one day and she said she was in a conservatoire for piano. We call her our Pastor Dick because she's fabulous. And she called us. She said, "Mom, I failed my test." I said, "Oh, honey, it's okay. That's okay. There'll be other tests." I said, "What was your score?" She said, "I got a B." A B? That's not a failure. A B. Some of us have never seen a B in our lives. Right? All right? We know what a B is. What's a B? We know here in the Bible school what they stand for. C stands for Christ. Okay, it's true. F stands for praise the Lord. We will praise Him. And really, the only A I have ever seen in my life is when I looked at my blood test. It's an A+. Thank you, Lord. I got an A positive. God knew I wasn't going to get it any other way. He said, "So there you go, that's your blood type. You get an A+. Like, thank you. It's true. But if there is a Saul in your life, let go. Let go of the bad feelings towards that Saul. Because Saul became Saul by not letting go of bad feelings towards David. That's how he became Saul. All right, so let's go now to section 2. And let's look at David's enemies. Now, while David was like a lamb towards Saul, he was like a lion towards his enemies. Again, in Psalm 18, verse 37 and 43, David wrote, "I have pursued my enemies." They're no longer chasing David. David is chasing them. "I have overtaken them. Neither did I turn back until they were destroyed. I have wounded them so they could not arise. They have fallen under my feet. You have given me the necks of my enemies so that I destroyed those who hated me. I beat them up as fine as the dust before the wind. I cast them out like dirt in the street." And David is referring to people, all right? People, flesh and blood people. He's referring to the Philistines, the Moabites, the Arameans, and on and on and on and on. They were flesh and blood enemies that David fought against battle after battle, and until they were totally, completely, and thoroughly defeated. But it's different, of course, for us, because most of our enemies, almost all of our enemies, they're not physical enemies. They are not flesh and blood people. Most of our enemies are spiritual enemies, and that makes them tricky because they're invisible. They're the powers of darkness. They are principalities and powers. We don't have people running after us, trying to kill us. And even if we did, Jesus said, well, then go ahead, let them. Someone slaps you on your cheek, give them the other one. Okay, here you go, I've got two. Take that one so that the red mark matches. Okay, looks good. So for us, the enemy is the influence of the powers of darkness. The powers of evil are our enemies. And we discover many of the characteristics of the enemies from David's writings in the Psalms. We find out in Psalm chapter 3, verse 1, that they are ever increasing. That means there's a lot of them. We find out in Psalm 5 that they lie. They lie. You can't believe a word they say to you. We learn that they're in a rage because of the righteous. We find that out in Psalm 7. In Psalm 11, we find out that the enemy, they hide and they wait for us to come along so that they can shoot from the shadows at the upright in heart. Imagine that. We mind our own business. We stroll along. We're innocent. We're just going our way. We're happy. Maybe we're singing a little song. And suddenly, sorry, I just baptized. I did baptize with sprinkling. And an arrow is released at us from the shadows, and some horrible, terrible thought or idea, boom, comes into our mind, and we are very happy that no one could read our mind at that moment, because we would be very embarrassed if anybody knew what we were thinking about. And we go, oh my goodness, how did I think about that? Why did I think about that? You know, it's awful. It's dangerous. You mind your own business, and the enemy shoots from the shadows at the innocent. We learn that our enemies are deadly. That's Psalm 17. Also, Psalm 17, we learn that our enemy is like a greedy lion, just wanting to eat us alive and wear out our flesh. We find out that our enemies are too strong for us in Psalm 18. And we find out in Psalm 27, our enemies are like false witnesses who breathe out cruelty. They speak evil of us, and they wish we would die. That's Psalm 41. They even tried to convince us that we have some dreaded, terrible, fatal disease. That's Psalm 41. You get a little scratch, and then what is that? It doesn't look right. And the enemy says, you're gonna die. You're gonna die. That's just not a normal scratch. It's leprosy. You're gonna die. And then you go, oh wait, it was just dirt. Right, just there it is, it's gone. They try to convince us, according to Psalm 41, that we have a fatal disease. And they lay snares for us. Now that word snare is the same word in Hebrew as the Hebrew word landmines. They want to blow us up. And then in Psalm 64, the enemy diligently searches out our iniquities. They are digging for dirt in our lives to point to any failure and condemn us. Any failure, large or small or imaginary. And the enemy reminds us of all that we have done wrong. That's Psalm 64. Psalm 42, the enemy oppresses us. They wear us down by constantly asking the question, where is your God? Where is your God? If we listen to the voices of the enemy with these characteristics, we will be like David in Psalm 55, verse 2, when he said, my thoughts trouble me, and I am distraught at the voice of the enemy. In modern translation, David says this, I can't take it anymore. My blood pressure is 220 over 140. I'm totally stressed, and I'm about to have a stroke. Right? That's what David was basically saying. And that's how we are if we listen to the voice of the enemy. And if there is anything like that in your life, that which says to you, God cannot help you, that which says to you, you're no good, you're not good enough, you're just not good enough, you failed too many times, or you've been discouraged too many times, or that voice that says to you, you're going to die. You're going to die because you have a little tiny, teeny little scratch, or you have a little cough. And the enemy says, you're going to die. You're going to die. You're just going to die. If you have anything like that in your life, thoughts plaguing your mind, those are enemies. David went after them. He pursued them. He overtook them. He beat them up. He conquered them. And that is what we should do with our enemies. Silence them. Do not allow them to pursue you and plague you. You pursue them. Destroy them over your mind, over your life, over your family, over your church. There is hope in God. Silence forever the words, there is no hope for you in God. Go after the enemy. All right, and then lastly, section 3, David's worst enemy. You know, Goliath was not able to defeat David, and neither could the Ammonites defeat David. They weren't able to do it. The Moabites were not able to defeat David, and even Solomon could not defeat David. And in the end, David did what his enemies could not do. David defeated David. David was David's biggest enemy. There were times David was afraid of Saul. David should not have been afraid of Saul. David should have been afraid of David. It's interesting when you study it, actually. Saul was afraid of David. Saul should not have been afraid of David. Saul should have been afraid of Saul. Absalom should have been afraid of Absalom. Shimei should have been afraid of Shimei. Joab should have been afraid of Joab, because they all did themselves in the end. They were their biggest enemy. And Pastor Joe said this. I'm going to quote him. And I'm sorry, whatever. Okay. He said this, quote, "The problem is no longer the enemy. The problem is ourselves as we face ourselves. We can be our best friend or our own worst enemy." Now, when we think about enemies, really, there's one enemy we actually don't think of. We don't consider it to be ourselves. We never consider that we might have a problem and that we might actually be the biggest problem. And that perhaps there is a flaw in us. Okay, I'm going to say me instead of, since we're saying, you say you, I say me. A flaw in me, and other people have a problem with me because I am the problem. What? We never think like that, do we? No, it's always the other person who's a problem. Always. Always the other person. We never think that someone might be having a problem because of you or me, and that we actually are the problem. We don't think like that. Jesus said, though, that's true. He said it like this: "Why do you look for the little tiny, teeny, tiny splinter that's in your brother's eye, and you forget about the huge, big tree trunk that's in your own eye?" Jesus said that. He said, why don't you first remove that great big log out of your eye, and then you'll see clear that you could take the little teeny tiny splinter out of your brother's eye. What was he saying? He's saying, you're a problem. He's saying, you are a problem. You are really a problem. He's saying, I love you, but you got to know you are a problem. Everyone say, I am a problem. Don't anyone say amen to the person next to you. Yeah, you are. I want to talk to you about that. And we have a tendency to see everyone else's faults except our own. And in every difficulty with another person, we think that other person is the problem. They're the Saul, we're the David. Have you ever noticed that? I've never heard anyone say to me, I work with someone, they are so excellent, so dedicated, so personable, just so godly, I don't get along with them at all. They are David and I'm Saul. Nobody ever says that. They're always Saul, but I'm David, you're Saul. If there's a problem, it's because you're Saul. I'm David. Did you ever notice with David and Jonathan? You're always David. The other person's Jonathan. Yeah. We're like David and Jonathan. Yeah, I'm David. That's Jonathan. I'm always the best. We think like that. We shouldn't. I read that 7 out of 10 people have some kind of difficulty with some other person, either at church, work, home, school, whatever. They might be your leaders, your followers, your in-laws, your outlaws, your children, your parents, your wife, your husband, your deacons, your elders, your neighbors, but they always think the other person is the problem. Now let's just count for a minute. 7 out of 10 people think the other person is the problem. Well, what about the other 7 out of 10? They think that you're the problem. Nobody thinks that they're the problem. Sometimes we are our own worst enemy. David was David's worst enemy. David did what no one else could do. David defeated David. Okay, let me look here on my notes because it's getting dark and I don't know what time it is. You know, David did not at first admit that there was a problem or that he was a problem. When David discovered Bathsheba was pregnant with his child, David didn't think that's my problem. He tried to make it look like Uriah's problem. It's Uriah's problem. He called Uriah, Bathsheba's husband, in from the army, from the battle. He said, "Hey, Uriah, how's it going in the army? Great, good, things are going good, great. Go home to your wife." Yeah, let it be Uriah's problem. Go home, sleep with your wife, and then it'll be like it's your child. David didn't look at it like it's my problem. He looked at it like, Uriah, it's your problem. Uriah didn't go home. So Uriah's the problem. Uriah's the problem, not David. I'm not, it's not me, it's Uriah. Why doesn't that guy go home? David brought him back to the palace, made him drunk, and said, okay, now go home. Go home to your wife. Uriah slept outside the palace doors that night. He didn't go home. David was thinking, what a problem that guy is. What's wrong with him? Why doesn't he go home? It would solve everything. So now David has to get rid of Uriah. But he's not going to kill Uriah. No. Let the Ammonites do it. It's their problem. They did it. Oh, the Ammonites did it. I didn't do it. No, David didn't think he was a problem. It's Uriah. It's the Ammonites. But eventually, David recognized that he had a problem. A serious problem. You know, in Palawan one time, we were robbed one time. Our house was robbed, my dirty kitchen. And some of you have heard this before. A thief got into my dirty kitchen. And I woke up in the morning and I went out the house. And there in my dirty kitchen, there's no stove. And I have never been robbed before. So I didn't know what happened. And I stood there. I thought, well, where did it go? Where did it go? It's got to be as though it has legs. And I went, oh my pots and my pans are gone. Oh, look, my gasol tank is gone. And then I realized we were robbed. Oh no, a thief got into my dirty kitchen and robbed us. Well, I did not sleep well after that. I mean, we'd make sure all of the doors were locked. I would check them again and again and again. I would ask my husband 100 times, did you check the door? Yes, it's locked. I said, you sure? Yes, it's locked. Will you go check? No, I will not check it again. Well, maybe it's open. No, it's not open. And I was awake with every little sound in the house. I'd hear a keek, I'd wake up. It's the thief. And you know, I thought, I've got to sleep. I've got to get over this fear. And one day I really did hear a sound. I heard a creak in our sala, in the living room. And I thought, it's the thief. I'm going to get that thief. That thief is in the house, and I'm going to get him. Of course, it's always a him. Never thought it was a her. I'm going to get him. We're too sweet to rob people. Anyway, I thought, I'm going to get him. And I actually got up, and I was shaking. Because I was scared. And I put my head outside my bedroom door like this. And a shadow passed in front of me. And my heart was pounding so hard, I could hear it. You could see it. Boom, 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 boom. And I thought, it is a thief. The thief is in the house. And I thought, I'm going to get him. I'm going to capture that thief. And I went out of my room. And I started going to the living room. And I saw it coming towards me. And I yelled, "Ah!" And I went to grab that person. And I ran into a mirror. A mirror. The shadow I saw was my own reflection. I had forgotten that we had a mirror in the sala. And when I looked, that reflection was my own. I learned something that day that was very, very important. I learned that sometimes my enemy is me. It's me. It took David a while to discover that truth, that he was his own worst enemy. But he did acknowledge it eventually. He acknowledged that there was something in his character that caused him to fail. In Psalm 38, David wrote this. He said, I am overwhelmed by my own foolishness. He writes of his sorrow. He writes of his brokenness. He writes of his shame. He said he was drowning in iniquity. In Psalm 40, David wrote this, my iniquities are more than the hair of my head. Well, for some people, that's only a few, right? For other people, it's a lot. My iniquity is more than the hair of my head. And Psalm 40, verse 9, is mistranslated. In the English Bible, it says this, David wrote, Lord, all of my desires are before you. And that sounds nice, doesn't it? All of my desire is before you. Doesn't that sound nice? As if the Lord, you know all of really the desires of my heart, and all of my desires are right before you. But that's not what David was saying. What he was saying was, Lord, all of my craving, my lust, my unlawful desire is before you. I cannot hide it anymore. You know everything. That's what David was saying. David came to the point where he said, Lord, everything is before you. And in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 11, it mentions fleshly lusts that wage war against our soul. But that was one war that David did not bother to fight until it was too late, and it wound up defeating him. In David's lineage, there was immorality with Judah, his forefather. His great-grandma, Rahab, was a harlot. In Psalm 51, David wrote this, I was conceived in iniquity, and in sin my mother conceived me. I don't know what he's talking about, but really I don't want to know. It's none of my business. But David knew, and he said in his lineage, in his background, there was an inherited weakness. And David ignored it until it almost destroyed him. But he repented. He deeply repented. He turned from that. He recognized that weakness within him. He turned from it, and he guarded himself against it in such a way that in Psalm 18, verse 23, David said, I have kept myself from my iniquity. I have kept myself from my iniquity. And we never hear of David sinning in a similar way after his repentance from his sin with Bathsheba. David did keep himself from his iniquity. And in Psalm 18, he said things like this. God has rewarded me according to my righteousness. God has recompensed me according to the cleanness of my hands, because I was innocent in his sight. David was able to write that because he knew he was so washed, so cleansed, that he never, at times, even remembered the things he had done in his past. Because there was such a deep cleansing and washing, he says, God has rewarded me according to my innocence. And then he said, I kept myself from my iniquity. I'm aware of it, he's saying. I'm aware of it, and I guard myself. And then he said, with a merciful, Lord, you are merciful. And it seems like David experienced the message of the song that we sang before. And I wonder if we could just stay seated. We're almost done. But Brother Dick, if you could play that. Could we have that, Kimi? Let's just sing this as if though we were David. And let's sing it really, 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 really slow. And let's think about what David was thinking about when he could say, God has rewarded me for the cleanness of my hands. I'm innocent. David, an adulterer, a murderer. He said, I'm innocent. I'm innocent. I'm washed because of God's cleansing, because he repented. Let's sing this and think about David for a minute. Really slow. By grace alone, somehow I stand, where even angels fear to tread, invited by redeeming love, before the throne of God above. It's how David felt. He pulls me close with nail-scarred hands into his everlasting arms. Verse 2. When condemnation grips my heart and Satan tempts me to despair, that scatters fear. The great I am, the Lord is here. Oh, praise the one who fights for me and shields my soul eternally. Boldly David approached. Boldly I approach your throne. Blameless now I'm running home. By your blood I come, welcomed as your own, into the arms of majesty. And as David wrote Psalm 18, he remembered God's great mercy. And he wrote, with a merciful, you will show yourself mercy. And I believe today that God wants to deliver us from all of our enemies, from the lies that come against us, that say, there is no help for you in God. It's a lie. It's a lie. It's a lie. Oh, there's no help. What you're trying to do, you can't do. It's too big. It's a lie. God is bigger. What you want to accomplish, you can't do. You don't have the resources. It's a lie. God has the resources. And he wants to silence the voice of our enemies today. Forever, silence. There is no help for you in God. There is help in God. And God wants to deliver us also from the hand of Saul. Saul has an expiration date on him. Saul is not going to be around forever. God will deliver you from the hand of Saul. But while Saul is around, let God do a work in you that he can do no other way. Thank God for that Saul. The day will come when God will deliver you from the hand of Saul. Hallelujah. And also, God wants to deliver us from ourselves. And many of you, he has delivered us from ourselves. And you've known a washing and a cleansing that has been so deep and real and beautiful that you can say, God has rewarded me according to the cleanness of my hands. But maybe some are here that you are saying, I have kept myself from my iniquity. And you know that there's something in your life that you battle. You battle. Build a wall around yourself. Guard yourself. Protect yourself. If you've fallen in an area once, it doesn't mean you have to fall again. David didn't. He only fell once, and then he got up again. You don't have to fall twice or 3 times. And God wants to deliver us from ourselves. And I wonder if just we could, let's just all stand and let's just in closing sing that song wherever we are, whether it's an enemy, whether it's Saul, or whether it's ourselves. Let's sing this and know that God, as Pastor Joe said, God is for us. He is for us. He is for you. Amen? Amen. Let's sing this.